Welcome to Stories Room. Enjoy listening and don't forget to subscribe. Thomas Barnes had always considered himself a reliable and devoted man. Over his life, he'd made many mistakes, but he sincerely believed that he had succeeded in the role of husband. He wasn't a great romantic, didn't write touching letters, and didn't arrange surprises every other day. Yet, for the 30 years of his marriage to Katherine Johnson, he had focused on one important task, being there when she needed him. He supported her dreams, helped raise their 2 sons, and then watched them move into their adult lives, trying to maintain close relationships with each. Their marriage wasn't perfect. In such a long union, it's impossible to avoid quarrels, resentments, and misunderstandings. But Thomas was used to thinking that the foundation of their relationship was strong, like a rock upon which they had built their own little universe. However, over time, cracks began to appear in that rock, cracks he either failed to notice or simply didn't want to see. As the years went by, daily life became more routine, and their feelings grew less vibrant. Sometimes Thomas caught Katherine looking at him with a hint of weariness, and he tried to chalk that up to age, hormonal changes, or the acute lack of the romantic sparks that had once brightened their youth. But he couldn't muster the courage to admit to himself that something more serious than mere boredom might be lurking behind her gaze. The warning signs began to emerge little by little. First, Katherine started disappearing from home in the evenings more often. "I need to meet a friend. We have a little class reunion. I'm going to the fitness club. I've completely lost my shape." Excuses piled up, and Thomas wasn't the type to check up on her or question her words. Then she began responding to text messages with suspicious energy, as if she were hiding a whole other life from him. He tried to find the right moment to ask who was texting her, but each time she gave vague replies. "Oh, it's just a colleague asking about a report," or "It's a friend of mine. We're talking about women's stuff. You wouldn't be interested." Thomas couldn't help feeling like a stranger in his own home. There was a lurking sense that an invisible wall was rising between him and Katherine. She turned away from him in bed more often, no longer sought his touch, and didn't engage in discussions about family activities. It was as if his presence didn't so much annoy her as fail to please her at all. His worry only increased when he noticed that one night Katherine came home around 1 a.m, smelling faintly of men's cologne that definitely wasn't his. When he asked, "Where were you?" she replied curtly, "We stayed longer at the gym, then I went with the girls to a cafe," and disappeared into the bedroom. That night, Thomas couldn't sleep. He lay awake, waiting for some clarification, some explanation, but Katherine seemed to have built a wall of silence. She lay in bed, breathing quietly, just a few steps away, and yet unreachable. The next morning, she was bright and chatty, talking about the weather and a sale at a nearby mall, but said nothing about her late-night escapade. Days went by, and Thomas's sense of unease kept growing. He tried bringing it up, even talking vaguely with his sons. Both were grown, with their own families. Thomas would drop hints. "Have you noticed your mother acting odd?" Or "Did she ever sigh about something unusual?" His older son, Peter, answered vaguely that he hadn't noticed anything. The younger, Kevin, just brushed it off. "Dad, maybe you're exaggerating. Mom's always been a bit reserved, and you're only seeing it now because you have too much free time." Their words did little to calm Thomas. He had known his wife for far too long not to notice changes in her habits. It was as if a new spark had ignited in her life, a spark she was carefully hiding from him. Finally came the evening when he realized he couldn't endure the uncertainty any longer. Katherine was once again going out to the gym. Thomas, pretending to be absorbed in a newspaper, casually asked, "Going to the gym again?" "Yes, dear," she said, forcing a chipper tone. "They have a group session tonight. I can't miss it." With that, Katherine left the house. Thomas waited 10 minutes, then put on his jacket, grabbed his car keys, and followed her. Guilt, shame, and a sense of violating her privacy warred within him, but his need to know the truth, no matter how awful, was stronger. He trailed Katherine's car at a safe distance, his heart pounding with fear that she might notice or that he might see something unbearable. Katherine's car eventually stopped not at the fitness club, but at a small, cozy bar on the outskirts of town, next to a tiny hotel. Thomas parked some distance away, careful not to draw attention, and watched his wife step out and meet a young man. He was easily 3 times younger than Thomas, tall, lean, with a slightly messy haircut and a confident gait. Thomas didn't know what hurt more, the realization of Catherine's lies or the sight of her smiling at this man, warmly, fondly, and in love. As they went inside, Thomas felt as though someone had squeezed his heart out. He had not seen such a smile on her face in many, many years. He stayed in his car for over 2 hours, occasionally glancing through the bar's windows and seeing their silhouettes. Catherine and the stranger held each other, laughed, danced. Thomas saw enough to confirm his worst suspicions. Near midnight, they finally emerged, stood briefly on the porch, and headed to the neighboring hotel. There was no longer any doubt. Thomas remained in the car, watching them disappear into the hotel doorway, feeling an icy knot of hatred and despair in his chest. Intellectually, he knew he could charge and right then and there confront them, unleash the fury of a betrayed husband. Yet something held him back, perhaps fear of hearing final, devastating words from Catherine, or some faint, desperate hope that he was mistaken. But no, he had seen it all. Late that night, he drove home, his soul aflame with humiliation, his mind desperate for answers. The more he replayed those images, her embraces, those tender looks, the more a sense of something dark and chilling began to grow within him. The next morning, their home felt alien to him. The windows, walls, even the old photographs on the shelves seemed tainted with deception. When Catherine came down for breakfast, she looked cheerful and rested. Thomas wondered how she could be so callous, pouring herself coffee as if nothing had happened. "Good morning," she said nonchalantly. Thomas kept silent for a moment, feeling a volcano raging inside him. Finally, he couldn't contain himself. "Catherine, tell me the truth. Who were you with last night?" She froze, dropping her spoon. Panic flitted across her face, only to be masked by forced composure. "What nonsense, Thomas. I told you. I was at the gym, then we went to a cafe." "Stop lying," he interrupted, struggling to keep his voice steady. "I saw you with that guy at the bar. I saw where you went afterward." For a moment, her expression twisted. She bit her lip, and then forced her gaze to harden. Realizing it was pointless to lie further, she shrugged nervously. "So what? People go to a bar, to a hotel. That doesn't mean I belong to him now." "Really?" Thomas let out a bitter laugh. "Because to me, it looks like you're cheating. And you've been doing it for some time." She avoided his gaze, her hands clasped together on the table. Then she spoke in an even, almost cold voice. "Yes, I have a younger man. His name is Lucas. We're just having fun. No, I don't think I'm destroying our family. It was already falling apart." Her words, "just having fun," hit Thomas like a physical blow. All those years together, everything they'd gone through. Could she truly cast aside their shared life for just having fun? "So it was already falling apart," he said slowly, struggling to maintain some semblance of composure. "Did it never occur to you that we could talk about this? Try to fix it?" Catherine looked at him wearily. "I told you many times I was tired of our dull routine, that I wanted to feel young and desired again. You did nothing, preferring to stay home with your papers, your magazines. So excuse me, Thomas, but I'm not returning to the swamp we called marriage." "Swamp?" he repeated, feeling darkness closing in on him. "You're calling our family life a swamp?" She said nothing, merely turned to the stove to pour more coffee, though her hand was shaking. "Let's just say we both need to start something new. The kids are grown and live their own lives. We're not interested in each other anymore. What's the problem? Let's get a divorce quietly, peacefully." Hearing the word divorce from her lips was Thomas's final breaking point. He almost physically felt something snap inside him, replaced by a cold fury. It seemed that she was deliberately twisting the knife, revealing her indifference, quietly and peacefully, as if their 30-year life together was only a mark and a passport. "And you think I'll just agree to that?" he asked, trying not to raise his voice. "What choice do you have?" she retorted, looking him in the eye with disdain. "I've already decided. I want to live while I still can." With that, she walked out of the kitchen, as though the entire scene bored her. Thomas stood, feeling the walls closing in, as though the air itself was thinning. He realized that their life was truly shattered, and at the same time, a terrifying but compelling thought took hold. He couldn't tolerate this affront any longer. In the days that followed, Catherine acted even more brazenly. She returned home late, openly laughed at her messages, and at times would say straight to his face, "I have to see Lucas tonight. I'll stay at my friend's place so you and the kids won't be uncomfortable." She showed no remorse. It was as though she continually reminded him that everything wrong in their marriage was his fault, while she was simply stating facts. Thomas realized he could no longer share a room with someone who felt this way about him. He moved into the guest room, but he didn't find peace there. Night after night, he couldn't shake the images. Catherine laughing with Lucas, going into the hotel, the door closing in Thomas's face. These thoughts triggered white-hot waves of rage and helplessness. He effectively lost all peace of mind and sleep. At work, everything fell apart. Colleagues noticed how distracted he was, but he fended them off. Family issues. Nothing major. I'll handle it. Inside, however, he felt a fierce anger that even frightened him. One evening, when Catherine was out again, Thomas sat at the table and pulled out a sheet of paper. Midnight had come and gone, and he felt exhausted and desperate, but he wanted to list all possible ways out. From the most rational, try talking to a psychologist, get a peaceful divorce and split our assets, to the most desperate, threaten her, cause scandals and fights, and, finally, the horrifying words that he barely managed to write. Radical revenge. Kill her or him. After writing it, his hand shook, and Thomas froze. What was he thinking? He wasn't a criminal. He had never raised a hand against anyone, not even against school bullies, and certainly not against loved ones. But the image of Catherine in another man's embrace wouldn't let him rest, especially the memory of her dismissive words. "I want to live while I still can," flung at him with bitterness and scorn. He tore up the sheet and threw it in the trash, staring at the scraps. Still, the fact that he had considered murder spoke volumes. It was monstrous, terrifying, but sometimes people awaken some animal instinct in themselves, leaving them shocked by what they're capable of doing. The next day, Thomas decided not just to follow Catherine, but also to shadow Lucas and find out who he was. That evening, as his wife received yet another text and prepared to go out, Thomas employed his usual tactic. He waited until she left, then followed at a distance. This time, they met in another part of town at a new pub featuring live music. Thomas parked near a neighboring building, walked along the street, and managed to catch a closer glimpse of Lucas. Hiding in the shadows, Thomas saw Lucas hugging Catherine, kissing her on the temple, whispering something that made her laugh and playfully push him away. A deep chill spread through Thomas. He watched the young man, an easy smile, a casual outfit, a cocky squint, maybe 27 or 28, about the age of their younger son. How can she? Thomas thought, the pain burning stronger than any previous outrage. How can she be so happy with someone nearly her child's age? They went inside the pub, and Thomas remained outside. His hands shook, and his mind repeated only one thought. She's not even trying to hide. She doesn't care if people see her. She doesn't care about me. He returned to his car, sitting there for nearly 3 hours in a daze. When Catherine and Lucas emerged, heading downtown while holding hands and leaning into each other, the sight wiped out Thomas's last restraint. He started his engine and followed them, making sure not to lose sight, his heart pounding as if it would explode. They arrived at Lucas's apartment in a brand-new residential complex. As soon as they disappeared inside, Thomas parked across the street, turning off his headlights. He stared at the lit windows. About half an hour later, lights came on in one window. Through the thin curtains, he saw silhouettes merging in an embrace. He watched, feeling a wild mix of jealousy, rage, and despair surge through his chest. He didn't leave his post until dawn, when the light finally went out and he slumped in his seat, utterly spent. A cold horror settled over him. He realized that he couldn't keep living like this. Either Catherine had to leave, or he had to. But he didn't want to walk away from everything, leaving his life in ruins. In the days that followed, he was barely functional, sleep-deprived, hardly eating, replaying scenes of betrayal in his mind alongside dark fantasies of venting his anger. At first, it was just heated thoughts. If only I could punch that cocky guy once. But soon, his imagination conjured more alarming images, holding a gun, forcing them to beg for forgiveness. A gun. Thomas had never owned a firearm, but he knew it was easy enough to buy one illegally in the city. A grim determination grew in him, and he understood it was a step into the abyss. Yet he couldn't stop. Every time he saw Catherine's cold, uncaring manner, it fueled his belief that she left him no choice. Eventually, he found himself perusing shady forums and hidden corners of the internet until he located someone who claimed to be a seller. One evening, Thomas met a man named Jim on the outskirts of town in a desolate row of garages. With trembling hands, Thomas handed him an envelope of money, and in exchange, Jim gave him a small package containing a revolver. It looked ordinary enough, used, but functional. Holding it, Thomas felt the weight of metal in his palm, triggering a reaction he'd never felt before, a savage clarity. He was doing the unthinkable. He hid the gun at home in a closet behind old tools, and in the evenings when Catherine went out, he drove to the countryside to practice shooting at cans and boxes. The sound of gunfire scared and jolted him each time, making his heart race, yet he persisted. He felt like a stranger to himself. Time passed, and one day Catherine bluntly announced that she had filed for divorce, handing him the papers to sign. Thomas betrayed no emotion, just stared at her darkly. She added that she planned to move in with a friend, or maybe with Lucas, but that it was still in progress. It sounded so casual that Thomas felt his insides clench. She sees me as nothing, he thought. That evening, he received confirmation from a less-than-official source. Catherine and Lucas planned yet another date at the same bar as before. Thomas knew which hotel they preferred once the bar closed, and he knew the receptionist rarely asked for their IDs anymore. They were regulars. He was ready that night. He donned a dark jacket and cap, concealing the revolver at his waist. He got in his car and followed them as usual, but this time, there was neither hesitation nor fear, only a cold, black calm. His heart beat steadily, as though all emotions had drained away. He waited until they left the bar, saw Catherine affectionately adjust Lucas's collar, smiling as she pressed close to him. Lucas had his arm around her shoulders, confidently claiming this woman. Thomas trailed them down a dimly lit street, keeping his distance until they entered the familiar small hotel. It was an old building with a creaky wooden door and a narrow hallway inside. Thomas passed by the reception unnoticed, as the clerk was distracted by a phone call. He already knew they were often given room 14 on the second floor. Its door stood ajar, apparently left that way by Lucas, who expected privacy. Thomas pushed the door. It squeaked. Only a bedside lamp was on, and he saw Catherine and Lucas standing by the window. She was laughing as she turned to see who'd come in, and then her smile vanished, eyes wide with terror. Lucas spun around, frowning, seemingly ready to fight or at least demand an explanation. "Thomas," Catherine began, her face going pale. What are you? You didn't expect me?" Thomas asked, his voice chillingly calm. The revolver was already in his hand, leveled at Lucas's chest. "Hey, man, take it easy," Lucas said, spreading his hands wide. "No need for violence." "Shut up," Thomas growled. His eyes locked on Lucas, a surge of loathing rising in his throat. He had pictured this moment countless times. Catherine rushed forward to grab Thomas's arm, but he shoved her aside. She tumbled onto the bed with a shriek. Lucas tried to lunge, maybe hoping to knock away the gun, but he was too slow. Thomas pulled the trigger. The gunshot thundered in the small hotel room. Lucas clutched his side and sank to the floor, agony and terror distorting his features. Dark blood began to spread across his shirt. Catherine screamed and looked at Thomas, then scrambled to Lucas, pressing her hands against the wound in a futile attempt to stop the bleeding. "Thomas, you've lost your mind," she shrieked, voice cracking. "Why?" He stood, breathing heavily, the gun still raised. His thoughts swirled in chaos, yet a coldness remained in him. "What did you think I was supposed to do? Just watch you trample all over me? Call our life a swamp?" "I'm sorry. I made a mistake," Catherine sobbed, holding Lucas's blood-soaked side. He moaned, his eyes filled with fear. "Mistake?" Thomas echoed with a bitter smirk. "No, You knew exactly what you were doing. He lifted the revolver again, his hand steadier this time. Catherine realized what was about to happen and tried to scramble backward. No, she screamed, standing up and backing toward the wall. Thomas, please. But there was no mercy on her husband's face. She saw only a consuming pain in his eyes. He fired again. The gunshot was final. Catherine staggered backward, choking, then collapsed to the floor next to Lucas. Their blood pooled together on the cheap carpet. Thomas stood there, looking down at the bodies, feeling his hand tremble around the revolver. Distant shouts echoed in the hallway. Someone must have heard the shots. He had to run. He realized he had only seconds left. Gazing at Catherine, whom he had loved nearly his whole life, he felt no triumph, only a vast emptiness. He flung the revolver aside, turned, and fled the room. No one stopped him on the staircase. The receptionist was on the phone, shouting confusedly at the police. Thomas burst out into the night, jumped into his car, and sped off. In his mind blared a single alarm. What have I done? What do I do now? He drove aimlessly until he reached the outskirts of town. There, he pulled over, gripping the steering wheel, his knuckles white. The thoughts were harrowing. The police will come. They'll find the bodies. I'll be the prime suspect. Catherine was my wife. The hotel cameras may have captured me. He knew there was no way back. That very night, Thomas went to a place he had prepared long ago, his late father's old house, empty since his passing. In the basement was a hidden storage space where Thomas kept some savings and fake documents for a rainy day. He never imagined he'd actually use them. But here he was. He dug out a stash of money and the forged passport under the name Henry Holmes. It felt like he was living someone else's nightmare. He changed clothes, switched his jacket, and burned his old garments in an iron barrel behind the house. Then he got into a different car, his father's old SUV, rarely seen in the city, and headed straight to the airport. It was pre-dawn by then. Thomas, watching the sparse traffic, knew that somewhere downtown, cops and medics were surely on the scene. News agencies might soon report a tragedy. Husband shoots wife and her young lover in hotel room. Would he become the city's most wanted fugitive? Probably. Yet the terror of arrest was overshadowed by the shock of what he had done. At the airport, he moved like a robot. He went to the international desk and bought a one-way ticket to South America. Any destination that would be as far away as possible from this horror. Every minute felt like an hour. He forced himself to remain calm and avoid attracting security's attention. Inside, conflicting emotions raged, horror at his deed, a numb sorrow he couldn't define as remorse or relief. Rather, it was a stark awareness that his old life was over. His flight departed at 10 in the morning. At passport control, his heart nearly stopped. He handed over the forged documents, avoiding the officer's eyes. The officer leafed through the passport, compared his face to the photo, and checked something on the computer. It felt like an eternity before the officer stamped it and handed it back, saying, "Have a nice trip, Mr. Holmes." Thomas, legs shaky, nodded and hurried toward the gate. He reached the boarding zone, sat down, and closed his eyes. Instantly, he saw faces. Catherine smiling as she had when they were young and newly married. Their sons looking expectantly at parents they believed would always stay together. And then Lucas with his smug face twisted in a dying grimace. "What have I done?" Thomas whispered silently. But he knew it was irreversible. His life had splintered, and he was fleeing to another continent. Yet he couldn't run from himself. He'd carry his memories in a shattered soul, day after day, always fearing discovery. He wanted to cry, to scream, to bang his head against a wall, but he couldn't. All that remained was mute numbness. Somewhere within, above the roar of the airplane engines, he heard a voice. "This is the outcome of your love and devotion." He lowered his head, closed his eyes, and remembered how, many years ago, he and Catherine exchanged rings, vowing to be together in good times and bad, never imagining those bad times could culminate in such a monstrous crime. Behind him were the photos on the mantel, dinner-time conversations, the laughter of children, care for Catherine's parents, plans for old age, and dreams of rocking future grandchildren. All of it, erased by one gunshot, then another. Now all that lay ahead was a foreign country, perpetual hiding, a new name, and a wound on his soul that would never fully heal. The plane climbed higher, the buildings and roads of the city receding below. Police were surely hard at work, searching. News outlets might already be showing the victims' faces in their reports. This flight was a flight from judgment, an attempt to vanish at the far end of the world. But Thomas knew he couldn't escape himself. Restless nights would bring him back to that hotel room, a room soaked in blood and unsaid truths, buried along with his wife. He realized that no distance could dim his pain and guilt. Yet fate offered no second chance. He had annihilated everything in that moment he pulled the trigger. High above the clouds, among strangers, he silently faced reality. His life had taken the darkest possible turn. No one close to him could ever have imagined Thomas Barnes capable of such a thing, nor had he himself. But it had happened. He understood that from this day forward, he would be pursued not only by the law, but also by his own conscience. Perhaps the police would eventually catch him, or he might turn himself in, or die in a standoff. Or he might live for years in hiding, adopting a false identity, watching his reflection grow older, a reflection of the man who had committed the unthinkable. Either way, there was no turning back. He was doomed to carry the weight of 2 stolen lives, turning a lifetime of memories and love into a black pit of crime. And no verdict could change the fact that once he had been a husband and father, and in a single night he became a murderer. The plane broke through the clouds, settling into its flight path. Thomas buckled his seatbelt and asked the flight attendant for a cup of water. He felt a wave of nausea rising, whether from turbulence or the trauma of what he'd just done, he couldn't tell. He closed his eyes, pressing his forehead against the cold window, trying to slip into a moment of oblivion. Yet the faces lingered in the darkness behind his eyelids, Catherine's smile, Lucas's brazen confidence, and then everything Thomas had experienced alongside that woman now lying lifeless in a hotel room. How did it come to this? He silently asked. No answer came. The plane flew on, leaving the city far behind. There were hours until landing in another country, and Thomas tried to imagine what his future there would be. Would he rent a cheap room, try to find some job under a false name, or perhaps sink straight into an underworld of anonymity? He had no idea. All he felt was a dull ache inside, a mixture of pain and emptiness. Though flickers of remorse pricked him, even stronger was the conviction that he could never return to his old life, and that everything he had wanted to protect, his pride, dignity, resentment over a destroyed family, had culminated in an even greater tragedy. Sunrise gleamed through the clouds, orange rays streaming past the plane's wings. For Thomas, that light meant nothing. His soul remained in that hotel room, soaked with blood and unspoken truth, buried alongside his wife. He pulled away from the window, slumping into his seat, unaware that a solitary tear ran down his cheek, a final goodbye to everything he once cherished. Ahead lay only infinite uncertainty and no illusion of salvation. Perhaps, in time, the world would forget him, but each night, when he closed his eyes, he would return to that room where rage had consumed him, leading to a dreadful crime he'd once considered unimaginable. He had learned that revenge brought no peace, only a deeper descent into loneliness and darkness. Thus did Thomas Barnes, once a devoted husband and father, become a fugitive murderer, leaving his country behind. And at 10,000 meters in the air, the remnants of his previous life drifted away like cold wind in the bright sunlight, highlighting the enormity of his crime. He knew he had already paid the price with himself, and that punishment would last for the rest of his days. That's the end of our story. Make sure to subscribe to our channel to stay up to date on new stories and share this video so others can discover these great stories too.